Welcome back, Honors. All right, so where did we leave off in class today? Oh, that's right. We kind of wrapped up all the Mesopotamia stuff, right? Make sure you go back and you kind of look over or study, or make sure you write down the rest of the stuff that we actually listed out in class, talking about the Akkadians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians, right? We talked about the Sumerians up front, and we also talked a lot about, like, big themes that kind of cover the expanse of Mesopotamia, including writing and literature and religion and architecture, right? With, like, their ziggurats and stuff like that. Also, quick heads up, check RenWeb to see the dates for all the quizzes coming up. Also check RenWeb, your study guide is being made available. Also, last but not least, check RenWeb for the practice geography quiz, all right, map. So anyway, but we left off talking about, like, the extension of Egyptian culture into their religion, right? We were talking about some of their major gods and goddesses. We talked about the judgment story and how mummification relates to their faith, right? Talked about the process of mummification. And then we kind of left off talking about, like, some of their other big gods, right? Khnum was one of my favorites, right? He's the god creator of people. He's this ibex right down here. Tot, or Toth, is the god of balance and intelligence. Another really cool one that I always thought was really neat was, like, they think that cats, like feline cats, are some of the guardians of the underworld. And another big part of this that I think is really cool is the Egyptians were some of the first to actually domesticate what you would now refer to as a house cat. And they were a lot of times used to guard religious temples that were full of grain and kept them safe from mice and other rodents and things like that. But my favorite god, like minor Egyptian god, is definitely this guy. This is Bes, right? And Bes is the dwarf god of mischief and fertility, right? So apparently if something like fell over in your house, or if something like broke or whatever, and there was no way to explain it, people would be like, oh, that's Bes, he's just running amok all over the house and stuff. But also apparently you would have altars and small ceremonies to this god in particular in ancient Egypt if you had a woman in your household that was trying to get pregnant, right? So, like, he was also the god of fertility. And another couple of all these cool things that I found is, like, going back with their religion and their culture and all these things mashing together, humans were not the only things that were mummified, right? We have actually found several mummified cats, which is like, these are a lot of mummified cats, so for any of y'all that have cats, sorry. And then also, this is one of my favorites, this is a mummified alligator, right? So that was a mummified alligator right there. They've found mummified hippos before. They found a ton of different animals that have also been mummified in the same or distinctly close process that would actually resemble the mummification of human beings, right? And then we talked about today in class how the mummification of human beings is a direct geographical relation to their religion and also their faith, having to do with the fact that they believe that heaven, of course, is this happy field of food set up, right? Let me make sure I'm recording. This happy field of food, so, like, the mummification process was very important because they thought however the body was buried, that is what the people would look like going off. Then we talked about how, like, mummification was very expensive, and that's why we looked at our one pauper's grave mummy, which is actually the poorer person that was just buried out in the sand, right? So we'll review that again a little bit next class too, just to go over it. But this Prezi is also going to be uploaded to Google Classroom if you want to be able to go through that. And then going forward, though, now we talked about their religion, and then we talked about their politics, right? We talked about political dynasties, and we talked about the dynasty system that was actually used in ancient Egypt, and we talked about a centralized government and how that was entirely based off a lot of different elements of their society. But what we didn't get a chance to understand is that actually Egyptian government and their religion are completely intertwined, right? And a lot of this is symbolized in their belief that their king is actually a god, right? The theocracy system. So Egyptians believe in a theocratic system, right? Or a government that is backed by religious ideals, right? So basically, Egyptians believe that pharaohs, or leaders of ancient Egypt, were blessed to rule by the gods, and with this power, they were believed to be an actual physical living God on earth, right? So they believed that their religion and their government were two things that were completely intertwined, right? Or a government that's backed by religious ideals, right? So we've talked about Egyptian cultural aspects, right? Something we didn't get a chance to review in class today was some of the geography of ancient Egypt, right? Northern Africa, we did talk about the way that they viewed their river, right? They believed that the Nile was a gift, whereas Mesopotamia was something they kind of feared. We talked briefly about, we didn't get a chance to talk about silt and the timing of the river, but that will come up again here in a little bit. But just kind of make sure that you're like brushing back over those things periodically. And once we wrap up Egypt, so in the next class period or so, we are actually going to be moving into the smaller kingdoms of the East, and that's going to be where our quiz on Mesopotamia and Egypt together are going to be, okay? So now we're going to be moving through the chronology of ancient Egypt, right? So what we just looked at was their cultural aspects, right? Religion, government, geography, like different little elements like that. But now what we're moving into is the actual time periods, right? So what is the purpose of a time period? Time periodization in history is where we actually, to try and make time over a huge expanse more understandable, we typically chunk those times into smaller pieces to give us a better way of tracking historical trends, historical events, and also just historical dynamics, right? So with ancient Egypt, they have 7 time periods, right? And let's go ahead and jot these things down real quick just so you can see the simple method, right? And here they are, okay? So it goes the Archaic Period, spelled A-R-C-H-A. Oh, I'll tell you what, this is what we'll do. All right, so we'll go ahead and jot them down, but we'll just get a new Google Doc rocking and rolling, and we'll just jot it down for you real fast, right? And that'll help. Or actually, we'll just pretend like we're adding a class comment, right? We're just going to jot it down real quick, okay? So here are the ancient Egyptian time periods. We go Archaic, right, first, and then it's the Old Kingdom, okay? And then it's the First Intermediate, and then it's New Kingdom, okay? And then it's, no wait, Middle Kingdom. Sorry about that. It's Middle Kingdom, and then it's Second Intermediate, and then it's New Kingdom, and then we'll back up a little bit so you can see, and then it's Third Intermediate, right? So now, what you probably don't realize yet, which is completely fine, archaic, there we go, is, as you can see, there's a definite pattern and a distinction in the ancient Egyptian time periods. Archaic, kingdom, intermediate, kingdom, intermediate, kingdom. And we'll explain that kind of as things go further. But what you can do real fast if you want is you can go ahead and pause this for a hot second, and you can go ahead and jot down all those time periods, just so you have a loose understanding of what Egypt is outlined as before we actually get into it, okay? But this actually is going to help us serve as a very, very good linear example of the progression of civilizations through high peaks and very low lows throughout the expanse of their civilizations, right? Because we do get into ancient Greece when we talk about their time periods, and when we get into Rome, we talk about their time periods, and then when we get into the Middle Ages, we talk about their time periods. It just kind of gives you a better way to grapple with the understanding of these large expanses of time, right? So, like I said, make sure you go ahead and get those things down, okay? So, and then we're just going to go ahead and get after it, right? So, those are the 7 ancient Egyptian time periods, right? Archaic, Old Kingdom, First Intermediate, New Kingdom, or Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate, New Kingdom, Third Intermediate, right? So getting after it, though, we have to, of course, start in the Archaic period, right? Now, Archaic, the word in and of itself means old or of original use, right? So basically what they're getting at with the Archaic period is they're trying to say that this is kind of the solidifying foundational era of ancient Egypt, right? And basically, this is how ancient Egypt became one big unified kingdom, okay? Due to the fact that there were a lot of people immigrating into the area and starting small establishments and small civilizations all over the Nile, under one large government during the Archaic period, Egypt was united into one concentric, centralized kingdom, right? And it was united into that kingdom by this guy, a guy that we have already talked about, right? And this is the death mask of this man, because all of the Egyptian mummies, would actually mummification process would usually be equipped with a death mask if they were royalty or if they were super wealthy. And his name was Meanies, right? And Meanies was the dude that Megan De La Cour, of course, knew the exact answer to that one today. Very, very good job. And how did he die again? Hippo death, right? Very, very tragic hippo death. Now, Meanies, of course, very, very solid figure, and somebody that you understand that we've already kind of gone over the Archaic period. All you really need to know for the Archaic period was that was when the kingdoms were unified, just like with Riley Cryer today in class when she was like, when we were talking about the crowns and the unification of the image of the crown actually going forward as a symbol of the unification of those kingdoms, right? So yes, the Archaic period was the cultural foundation of ancient Egypt, right? The political and cultural foundation. And ancient Egypt went from being just an area in North Africa that had a river valley and a couple of small civilizations and actually got turned into one large kingdom. And so once the Archaic period ended, we then entered into what was known as the Old Kingdom, the oldest of the kingdom periods. That is the first of these three kingdom periods, right? So if you notice that fluidity every time it went Old Kingdom, First Intermediate, Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate, you have to understand the word kingdom usually means, or in this sense, always means, a period characterized by growth and prosperity. So basically, it was an era in Egyptian history and time that is characterized by extreme growth, good economic times, prosperity, and cultural enlightenment. All right, so the intermediate periods that follow each of them are characterized by hardship, death, and war, usually, which is why we have a little erg. All right, so like usually hardship, death, war, okay? A lot of times famines can be related to these intermediate periods. Invading tribes of people like the Hyksos or the Hittites, right, which we will talk about later, is also very characterized in these intermediate periods, whereas kingdom periods are always positive, okay? So, starting with the Old Kingdom, though, now that we understand the difference between kingdom periods and then intermediate periods, right? The Old Kingdom spans the 3rd through the 6th dynasties, right? So, 3rd through the 6th dynasties, and it ranges from about 2686 BC to about 2181 BC, right? And the biggest thing about the Old Kingdom is the guy that really got them started off on a heavy foot, right? Started off on a positive political note. And his name is King Djoser, right? King Djoser. Considered the first true god king of Europe. Best way I remember him is I always imagine a DJ sitting on top of a pyramid, and it's like DJ Ozer, right? And he's actually just getting after it a little bit. I don't know why, but it always helps me remember. And I have artwork in my room of kids that have used that to remember the different, like this particular, like pharaoh in and of himself, right? So King Djoser is very, very important because he centralized, like as that first god king of Europe, the big thing he did was he centralized power in Egypt by turning each city into what was known as a nome, right? So he divided them into these nome patterns. So what you need to think about this is as what makes the United States fluid and easy to actually rule over from a great distance away. Is the United States a centralized government? Yes, we are, right? We are ruled federally from one location in Washington, D.C., right? Those federal laws, executive orders, and different like lingering, any kind of enforcement of law or lingering acts actually then get fed down to what is the next level of government? The state government, right? So imagine the nomes of ancient Egypt as the states are to the United States, right? Because each city was separated into a nome, almost like a province, right? And it's what we would kind of call like the states today. It's a very, very smooth move when you actually think about it. So here's their capital city of Memphis, right? And these nomes were divided up here, but you see every single time you see a little red line, that is a different nome area of ancient Egypt. It's a very, very genius method that Djoser invented to try and give power, dynamic, accessibility, and easeability of rule to this gigantic kingdom that was now under one giant centralized government. It's absolutely genius. The Old Kingdom, though, then continues to roll forward because with this economic prosperity, you begin to see the earliest phases of architecture that begin in ancient Egypt. And of course, we have talked about architecture already, right? And what you'll notice as time progresses forward, most civilizations can be characterized by certain architectural elements, right? So those things considering like when Mesopotamia, we talked about the ziggurats, right? In ancient Greece, we will talk about columns. In ancient Rome, we will talk about arches. In ancient Egypt, though, we usually always kind of get keyed off with religious temples, like the Temple of Djoser, but the biggest one out of all of them, of course, is the pyramid, right? The pyramid, yes, everybody knows what a pyramid is, right? Very large religious tomb structure with a square base and a triangular shape pediment, right? So the big thing about it is you saw the earliest signs of pyramids during this time period, right? So some of the big ones, for example, include the medium pyramid. This is one of the very first large base pyramids that actually originated in ancient Egypt, right? And does it look nearly as good as some of the other ones? No. All right, so it doesn't look very well done at all. It's because it's one of the earliest attempts at building a pyramid in all of ancient Egypt. What pyramid is Djoser? Yeah. There we go. All right, I got to check something real quick. Yeah, nice. That's what I thought. All right, cool. Sorry. I just had to double check something real quick. But the original use of these pyramids were almost always used as religious tombs or embalming places or burial sites of some of the biggest kings and rulers of ancient Egypt. Now, this is the medium pyramid. This is actually called the bent pyramid. Big reason why I like to show the bent pyramid from the Old Kingdom, even though it looks kind of crusty, is just due to the fact that, as you can see, notice the outside edge of the pyramid. Look at the medium pyramid, and let's look at the progression of architectural scheme into this next phase, right? So instead of having this layered-like top, almost like a Mesopotamian ziggurat, now we're moving into smooth side pyramids, right? Now, interestingly enough, I'm talking completely smooth on the exterior. So the ancient Egyptian pyramids were actually so smooth on the outside, you could basically, theoretically, ride like a skateboard down it, right? A lot of people believe that it was these blocks that were stacked in concentric circles that would actually then kind of get slower and slower and slower and slower and lower and lower and lower as we actually got to the top. But funny enough, the pyramid architectural style of ancient Egypt, particularly actually keying off in the Old Kingdom period, they actually had smooth edges to them. Now the issue, though, something you need to kind of keep in mind for the rest of your existence in a Western Civ class, is typically when things begin to fall apart, it is because of mismanagement, poor upkeep, or theft, right? So a lot of the exterior edges of a lot of these pyramids, the limestone that was used to build them was actually usually harvested to build many of the modern areas in Egypt today. All right, so that is why the pyramids of Giza look the way they do. Now that one right there, that is the pyramid of Djoser, conceived by a man by the name of Imhotep, which is actually one of the viziers or advisors of King Djoser, the gnome guy himself. He is actually buried inside of it, or he was. All right, anyway, so the big thing about it also is religious temples are going to start popping up. So these religious temples are going to start kind of showing up throughout ancient Egypt. You're going to start seeing things like obelisks being like a very major part of Egyptian society and as well as Egyptian architecture. You're going to see some early columns as well become a part of Egyptian society, but we'll talk about those things a little bit later on, okay? Now, the Old Kingdom, to keep rolling forward, constructions of the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx is going to actually begin during this time period as well. Most of these being completed around 2586 BC by a guy named Khufu, right? So King Khufu, what a name. Speaking of him, though, let's talk about how people felt about this particular pharaoh. Guess how many statues of Khufu there are? One, and it's only about this big. If a guy by the name of Khufu starts building the Great Pyramids of Giza, which is, of course, this is one of the examples of the Great Pyramid of Giza, located in Cairo or outside of Cairo, why aren't there more statues of it? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that most of most of the Great Pyramid construction was done by slave labor or forced labor that Khufu enforced on his people, right? So we don't have many statues of him left anymore because no one liked him, and when he died, a lot of them were destroyed. His tomb was also robbed, all right? So, but just to kind of give you an understanding of, this contextual, when these large buildings were being created and things like that, the great thing about this Old Kingdom period is it shows the gains of architecture in Egyptian development, okay? So as the Old Kingdom began to progress forward, when you started with something like the medium pyramid, then went to the bent pyramid, went to the pyramid of Djoser, and then we're eventually getting to the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx, that shows you that the Egyptian culture was progressing forward. Art in construction and architecture are almost always direct results of positive economic times, positive intellectual growth, right? And you could actually see this in art as well. So this, of course, being the Sphinx, being a very, very major site in ancient Egypt. But as we can see also, arts began to progress forward. Egyptian sculpture actually began to progress forward. And the ancient Egyptians' ability to create art and concentration is a very important progress in the Old Kingdom period. So the Old Kingdom period was a massive success for the ancient Egyptians. But unfortunately, an issue is going to start popping up because then the first intermediate period shows up in 2181 BC. Now, this was defined by civil war, right? So, big thing you have to remember is Egypt was originally an upper kingdom and a lower kingdom, right? Ironically enough, when you look at it on a map, you would think it's the other way around, but remember, the Nile flows south to north, right? So, you have to understand, all of a sudden, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt actually divided, okay? Now, no one is really absolutely positive of why this happened, but a lot of it usually goes back to, most historians theorize that it all goes back to dynastic fallout, right? When two leaders begin to try and vie for a throne, usually ends up leading to a civil war. So political power was going to be divided between the upper and the lower kingdoms, and a massive civil war is going to break out when one of the kingdoms tries to install their own leader. Temples and tombs are going to be pillaged and robbed. Some of the best artifacts of ancient Egypt were actually destroyed by its own people during these civil war-like conflicts during the intermediate periods. Now, Lower Egypt is going to eventually end up winning this entire conflict and forcefully reunite Upper and Lower Egypt together. But here's the issue. How does that concept of a civil war possibly play into this theocratic idea? How is it possible whatsoever that you can have a theocracy, which is a religious-based government, and then also at the exact same time have a completely functioning political system? Because if your religion is dependent on your government, then doesn't that kind of throw it all out the window when two guys start claiming the throne, right? Civil wars began to lead to a very big questioning of theocratic governments, right? So this right there actually being some of the earliest documentations of the first intermediate period. This is really interesting, kind of giving you a little bit of an inlet into Egyptian society. This is actually what Egyptian soldiers during the first intermediate period would look like. As you can see, they're carrying simple bronze weaponry and things like that. And also, this is another amazing thing, is as they began to progress, of course, they're going to start building things like composite bows. Of course, this is actually from a little bit later. They actually even attempted to tame and domesticate cheetahs, which is going to fail. Now, anyway, the Middle Kingdom, though, following that first intermediate, is going to lead to that rebirth in intelligence and government, right, which is super positive. Or as you can see, ooh, right, very, very good, because that Civil War chaotic period really kind of started to poke a lot of holes in that theocratic subset idea of Egyptian history, right? But, just to give you a heads up, the Middle Kingdom is going to span the 11th through the 12th dynasties of ancient Egypt, and the most impactful leader throughout the Middle Kingdom period is a guy by the name of Senusret, right, who had the largest impact as pharaoh, and he worked to establish Osiris as one of the chief gods. He tried to explain the Nile and the authority of the pharaoh using this story to reinforce that theocratic idea, right? So also, he created the very first effective bureaucratic system. And a bureaucracy is a multi-leveled government, okay? Just to give you a couple of understanding ideas about what a theocracy is, I'm going to show you really, really fast, okay? So, check this out. I'm going to draw this up here real quick. Do I have a marker on me? Nope, I don't. Hold on a second. Here we go. All right. So, a bureaucracy is a multi-leveled government system, okay? So, Senusret being the very first pharaoh to actually create this bureaucratic system and officially bring some type of peace back to ancient Egypt, right? There we go. Basically, imagine a bureaucracy like this. So the issue with ancient Egypt is the fact that it's a very large kingdom, right? I know some of you are like, hey, a pyramid, this makes complete sense. Calm down, nerd. So the big thing, this is also way too small. All right, there we go. Let's try to draw this again. There we go. Okay. So ancient Egypt is an extremely large state with over 25 different nomes following the progress of Djoser, with now large-scale architecture, unfortunately forced upon people under Khufu. You're now going to see Senusret kind of create an effective bureaucratic system to try and prevent something like a civil war from occurring again, right? So in this system, the issue you have is how many figures do we have at the very, very top? Well, we only have one, and he's a pharaoh, right? That conjunction of religious leader as well as a government and governmental leader at the exact same time. Well, to be able to rule effectively, he had to have a societal subclass system beneath him, right? So every single time you go down a layer, each of these groups of people would have specific jobs, right? So under here we would have the priests, right? And these priests would actually report to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh would actually send them demands, and the priests would then parlay that to the tax collectors, right? Which would be then going to the farmers, right? And then that would actually end up going down to the slave laborers down here, and as it would then continue to progress forward. So this is that multi-level bureaucratic system. To be able to rule effectively from a centralized kingdom, you have to have a bureaucracy or a bureaucratic system, right? So again, pharaoh reports to priests, priests reports to tax collectors get the taxes from the farmers, and the farmers enforce their labor on the slave system that the forced labor system that the Egyptians had used for several hundred years. Now, as you can see, this system was what kept the kingdoms unified and is what gave the pharaoh the ability to rule over all these people. If you want a simpler way to think about this as well, just think about a bureaucratic system as kind of how Chappelle is ran, right? We have Miss Dantagnan at the very top, and then underneath her we have the vice principals, and then we have the teachers beneath them, and then beneath them we have the guidance counselors and everybody else, and then your parents, and then basically everybody else in existence, and then you guys are down at the very, very bottom. All right, so now anyway, but that is where we're going to stop, right? And we're going to kind of take a break from all this time periodization stuff, and we're going to kind of continue to talk about the growth and expansion of life in the Middle Kingdom, considering things like taxation, how that worked, daily life, diet, stuff like that, and kind of just so you get a better grasp of what Egypt was starting to look like at its height. All right, so I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.